Chapter 2 Reflections. In the next few days, Father and I worked feverishly getting the cabin in readiness as a residence. No more than 14 feet by 9, Father thought it was much too small, so he began to add another 2 rooms, one for me and a kitchen. We didn't have running water and never would, but we would be comfortable. Gradually, I would get to like it immensely. The bush was all around us, and I was belly to belly with nature, and by the twitter I knew there were birds galore. The river was never far away. Within 2 weeks, we had the place completed, and Father went out and bought paint, and we both painted it. The place consisted of 5 acres of good river bottom land and another 5 acres of hillside. Father, who had neglected this rich land, now turned his attention to working it. I only hoped he wouldn't do anything as foolish as to borrow money on it, because we would get along without risking loans. He began to put in bananas and vegetables such as cabbage, tomatoes, and callaloo, and also pineapples, and he was preparing a place for a few yams. Everything seemed hunky-dory for a while until school reopened in January, and I faced the realities of our misfortune. On the first day, I rode marble to school, and although I thought what a good thing it was for me to be the only boy in that school to arrive on a horse, I found it was not so at all. Sure, I was the only one, but that made me odd instead of being important. At another time, a boy would have been cheered to have ridden a horse into the schoolyard. His cronies would have gathered around to touch the animal, to speak to it, and ask questions of its rider. But now, since it was Ramy Johnson, in the shadow of his father's failure, I was jeered. They gathered around all right, but it was to laugh. A boy in my village never rode on a saddle. He rode bareback, but they laughed at that too. "Where's your saddle, old man?" they said. "You too poor to afford one?" And they laughed again. I didn't answer. I didn't cry. I knew I shouldn't cry, but it was very hard. I sat there on Marble's back with them around me saying every conceivable thing against me. I saw Arlene, followed hard by Brad, duck into the school, ashamed now of their brother, Remy, the outcast as father. Why were they ashamed? That alone steeled me. I slid from Marble's back and tethered her along so she could eat grass while she waited. A train of them followed me, but somebody behind, it sounded like Collie Rayner, said, "Leave him alone, you bunch of fools." Collie was respected among all the boys, so my train got smaller. The school bell buzzed 9 o'clock and we all went in. It was my worst school day ever. I couldn't do my work nor answer a sensible question. Miss Fletcher, my home form teacher, was appalled at my ignorance. I couldn't tell the history teacher who Christopher Columbus was, nor could I tell her the capital city of my country, my own country. And on top of that, I got all my mathematics wrong. For every mistake I made, my classmates laughed. It wasn't that they wanted to laugh, it was that they were supposed to. They didn't care about Father. It was for me that they did what they were doing. Because I had stuck with Father, everybody thought now was the time that he should be deserted for good. Because I was identifying with him, that and only that made them laugh. For often when I met Arlene and Brad on the road, I noticed how tender everyone was to them. Nobody seemed to even look at them directly for fear that such a look could have been misconstrued. They went out of their way to play with them or to upgrade friendships with them. Me, they despised. And it wasn't difficult to understand. Who wants to be on the side of a loser? Who but Ramy Johnson? For they all, almost to a man in the village, now depended on Jake Hibbertson for their life, the big rich godfather of the village. He now the sole purse string operator. For although the people had farms of their own, they were small, hardly viable plots. good enough for turning out their food supply for a surplus for a penny earning income, but they had to work for Jake to supplement their earnings. He had the work and the money to pay for it, and now with father's farm, he had more work. The two shops were his too. How he had come by them could have been in the same wily way he had obtained our farm, though that was something that I didn't know for sure. But he had them, and the people went there to spend their weekly wages, and Jake was now the holder of a vast monopoly. As a matter of fact, everybody was supposed to hold us in derision just because of that. Because if they sympathized with us for being Ramy Johnson and his father, Jake could have been angry, and Jake must not be angry. Miss Fletcher, my form teacher, was far from being pleased with me either. Not necessarily because of the fact that my schoolwork on that day was so rotten, but perhaps because Jake was the chairman of the school board, and nobody wanted to jeopardize his or her job at a time like that. Perhaps, too, being such a rich man and still unmarried, he was a good potential husband. Jake must have been 45 or 48, but so what? Miss Fletcher was brushing close on 35 and the only one on the staff excepting Ma who was unmarried. Yes, Jake was quite eligible, for why were so many women getting dressed up and walking by his house for no good reason except that they must have wanted to put themselves on the market? He was a desired man, but by no means desirable, sought like gold, yet not possessing an ounce of charm. He was as stiff as wood and cold without life. He was a cashier at work, thinking money and nothing else in this wide world. Apart from his owning the Jaguar, he didn't live well, not that I knew of. His house was scarcely better than a cabin, a small white L-shaped building. From the outside, the prettiest part of it was the veranda, with its quaint rails and climbing ivy plants. Our former house at Robin Hill was a palace to his and was better furnished as well. This must have been one of the wee reasons why father had failed, because he spent so much on things to make us happy, things which other people did not care much about. Father had always cared about us, too much in fact. Whenever he returned from town, he brought us new clothes for extended happiness and candy for a temporary one. And for Ma, it was a big kiss and something nicely wrapped up in a box, the personal one, and something else for the house, but something which she had always wanted. That was how father lived. But father was more lavish than that. His generosity extended beyond our walls. At one time, he was the village's big shot. Then he possessed most of the best lands and the finest cows and the mules. And he alone was capable of loading 4 trucks full of bananas on Banana Day. And he had yams which he could sell 5 tons at a time and sugarcane as well. There were mangoes and coconuts on his farms and all kinds of non-cultivated things such as jackfruit and avocado pears, and people came and helped themselves to them. They hid, of course. They'd go in the early morning and fill their baskets of mangoes or pick up the coconuts which had fallen ripe to the ground and sell them and make a few shillings. They did this, and when he caught them, father would say, "Look here, don't you know not to do that? To ask me first?" And they said, "Mr. Johnson, sir, I won't do it again. I beg you, sir." And then he let them go. That was the only time to my knowledge that I heard them affix Mr. to his name. For them he was always Son Johnson. And father never minded, for, laughingly, he would say, "There's no Mr. to my birth certificate." But what I am getting at is that they called him Mr. only when they wanted him to be lenient, more lenient to them than he already was. They knew better than call Jake anything but Mr. Jake or Mr. Hibbertson, because he would hold it as a grudge against them. Jake was a wolf for prestige and power. They knew even better than that, never to go on his farm seeking, or rather stealing, his mangoes, or much worse, his coconuts, for he had slapped a few in jail for it too, and the people respect that. The funny thing, though, was that they came to father's property on their raids, but when they had some money to spend, they bought from Mr. Jake. Father never changed, though. Ma complained without result. All father said was, though, they only let themselves down acting like that. And Ma would rage, while Jake gets rich as they plunder you. And father, so what the hell's money? It isn't life, is it? Ma was right. Jake was getting and had got rich. Father was right too. Money isn't life, though. I must concede that it is an important part of it, too important a part of it. People would tie their animals on our farm too. They'd sneak in at night and tether them to eat our grass, which wasn't bad for what is grass. But sometimes the animals pulled up their stakes and ate things other than grass, such as our crops. And if father caught them, he'd pardon the owners. Jake, he impounded a few animals and had them sent to the town, to which the owners had to trudge the distance and pay the pound fee to get them back. And sometimes, too, if they had eaten Jake's crops, there'd be an official valuation and they'd have to pay plant by plant. After a few penalties like those, they stayed away from his place, and like it was the plague. Yet these accumulated kindnesses on father's part could not have lost him his property. It was more than that. There were bigger things. He seemed to have lost his knack with money. Having found himself wealthy, he thought he should have been Father Christmas right through the year. Workers did poor jobs and he excused them. Alas, there were men on the payroll who were in other places, and father didn't know what his supervisors were up to. When he began to realize his loss of a grip on things, he began to gamble, to lose it fast and to borrow again. No man gets more desperate than a gambler who loses because he is always trying to win his losses back, but only adding to them, and he forsakes his duties. Ma had talked her throat hoarse, but it was no good. So she left him, got a temporary separation. I think it was what she meant, just to shake him up, but father went down faster. He couldn't take that. His wife having left him, he, Son Johnson, coming to that. He gave up. He was utterly lost, and what was intended to have been a surgical separation began to look like a permanent thing. For Ma took a job at the high school, maintaining herself. But she must have had a big reason for moving on to a divorce. She must have known about father's gambling and thought that was the last straw. For that was what she did. Divorced father on the basis of incompatibility. What had begun as a sham had become a fact. Time was when he used to lend Jake money. In those days, Jake was down. He'd come up to the house, Ma said, and lie about something such as his relatives in another part of the country being in trouble of some sort, and father would lend him money he needed to bail them out. Jake would disappear for a day or two, but he didn't go near any relatives because he didn't have any. And the next thing they knew, Ma said, was that Jake became the proud owner of a piece of land in the village, bought with father's money, which he had lent without interest or terms. And it took them some time to catch on to what Jake was up to. And so Jake came up fast. Father was indeed a funny man. He was the only big farmer who had any time for people, especially people like boys. But father had grown up like any other boy in the village on a farm, having fished in the rivers and ridden animals barebacked and whittled wood and made things out of it, things such as tops. And when he grew up, he was still a boy like. He made things for boys, fish pots and tops, and some of them who were afraid to approach him needled me to ask him to make something for them. He did. He'd sit up late at night and do them. Ma was always cross, but father didn't mind at all. He'd pick us all up on the road, as many as 10 boys squeezed into the car, and he'd ask, "Where you boys want to ride to?" And the resounding unanimous answer, "Anywhere, Mr. Sun," and he'd do it. Driving along the river road, then up the steep pomade hill, so that we fell back and watched the top of the hood angling up, or he'd drive us across a fresh cut sugarcane field tippled with stumps, twisting and cavorting across the wide open spaces, guffawing more than a hyena. Father was that kind and crazy too. He'd enter the Christmas garden party contests, much to Ma's chagrin. "You're a big man now, Merton," she always called him that. "So what? You ought to be an example in the village." Meaning, to act more proper and like a responsible man, as if you're the owner of Robin Hill and not a worker on it. "Look here, Debbie, what you want me to do? Stop living? Say to myself, I am the owner of Robin Hill, and as such, I am no longer flesh and blood as the poor brutes out there? No, ma'am, I won't say it. My God, I've always thought people have created impossible roles for parsons and teachers, and here you are extending the same to me. Does this really make me less of a man if I do what I like to do? People respect seriousness in a man, Merton." "People be damned," he'd say, and he'd enter anyway. Ma couldn't stop him. Not anything barring illness could stop him. And to my knowledge, he was never sick. He'd enter the barebacked mule and the donkey funny races in which you rode facing the animal's tail, and he'd shoot at the bullseye for a ham leg like any other man, lying on his belly and squirming into the ground for a better position, the gun powing, and he jumping up splinter faced with laughter and running down to look at the bullseye, saying, "Oh me, oh my," the happiest times of his life. And better still, or maybe worse, he was a member of the John Canoe dancers who masqueraded in various costumes at Christmas time, dancing for money, cavorting to the quick boom, 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 boom of the drum. As a matter of fact, he was the one who organized the dancers to ensure the survival of the culture, he said. Ma thought that that was the last straw, but father and us children, maybe only father and I, thought it was fun. He was one of the best dancers too, and it was magical to hear him cracking the whip and saying, "Oh la la, gimme money! Oh la, gimme money! Oh la la, gimme money!" He was not merely on the cricket team, but he was the captain. People were always fascinated by him. He was an eccentric if you had money. If you were important, you weren't supposed to do these things. He had money, he was important, and he did them and was accepted. He was liked. For everybody, he was Son Johnson. He was so much fun, perhaps too much, trusting everyone and being exploited by just about everyone. It didn't even seem to have bothered him, their exploitation of him. "Ah," he'd say, "people like those are not better than animals, and if you retaliate, then you become one of them." And all this time that Ma was criticizing father, she was abusing Jake. She said father was a soft-hearted fool. To Jake she referred as the rake, which wasn't a bad name considering that it rhymed with Jake, and he was tall and slim too, and his teeth were a bit scattered around his mouth. So judge how surprised I was when at the end of our first week at River Bottom, I stopped to see Ma and Arlene and Brad at their house to say hello. I knew she'd be happy to see me as I to see her. I mean, we saw each other at school, but some visiting has to be done at home to make it family-like. And although she had divorced father, I had nothing against Ma. She was as good as a mother could be, better than most, and the fact that I had stayed with father was no indication that I bore ill will against her. It was just that I wished to be with father, that I thought it was the right thing to have done. But as I was saying, I stopped by at Ma's house, and surprise of surprises, Jake was there. Not businesslike and hawk nosed, but relaxed, sitting in a rocking chair that was once father's favorite. We were both frightened, he and Ma was uncomfortable. He was the first to recover. Well, well, he said, resuming his rocking, if it isn't Remy. Say hello to Mr. Hibbertson, Remy, Ma said. I looked searchingly at her. Where was her disdain now? But then I remembered he was chairman of the school board, a bird whose feathers you didn't ruffle unnecessarily if you were on the teaching staff. For the first time, I saw through Ma. Ambition had made her act in this strange way, made her put the pressure on father to be an example in the village. Then, when that failed, she effected a separation, a catalyst. But with father, that failed too. Frustrated, she got the divorce. Ambition, I hate you. Ma said, say hello to Mr. Hibbertson. But instead of greeting him orally, I nodded. I was afraid I would have said rake. Mr. Hibbertson and I are just talking, Ma said somewhat apologetically, about school and things. Jake was smiling, rocking and smiling, with his pith helmet off. He looked different. His hairline had receded, and without the hat, he had that brushed, sleek, lizardy look. I didn't like him. Ma looked at me, then at Jake. I have been trying to persuade Remy to come and live with me, but no luck so far. Why don't you go? Why don't you, young man? Jake said. I didn't look at him. I looked at Ma. No, ma'am, I said. I'll stay with father. Jake said, a chip off the old block. I didn't know how he meant it, complimentarily or in a derogatory way, but I didn't care. Here, Ma said, rising. Have some milk and a piece of cake. I'm not hungry, Ma. Yet I was hungry, but disgusted more than hungry. She came back and sat down. Remy has become so impossible, she said to Jake. He's so cold to me, but the Lord knows I tried. Adding, his father's poisoned him against me. Jake was still smiling, no wider, no narrower. I was surprised to have heard Ma say that, though, the thing about father, for he wouldn't open his mouth against her. He wouldn't in any little way harm Ma. He loved her, but maybe she didn't mean it. It was one of those cases in which she had to say something. She was just acting out a part. She had gone to a place of no return and was just obeying something like fate. Having known that she had made the first move, she was too embarrassed to go back to father now, but I was sure that she still loved him. Or why, in her guarded way, was she always asking about him? Pride, pride, pride. Just as a bad thing as gambling. It was gambling that had made father sink that fast, and this wretched pride of Ma's had stifled her love for a good man, and a truly good one at heart. Two lost souls, really. Both Arlene and Brad appeared in the kitchen door with milk stains and cake crumbs around their mouths. I joined them in the kitchen and they sat down again. Arlene was 12 and Brad 10. Arlene cut me a piece of cake, and to be frank, I eyed it for a whole minute before I turned it down flatly. Jake's presence upset me. Arlene said, "You're such a fool." She said it in such a dainty way that it didn't even sound bad. After a time, she went on, "Come on and stay with us, boob." "I can't," I said. "Father needs me." "Needs you?" she said. "What about Ma?" "She has you and Brad," I said. Brad looked up momentarily, but he was far too busy with his cake and milk to mind me or join Arlene in persecuting me, if, of course, he knew the fine points of persecution. "What's he doing here?" I whispered to Arlene, jerking my head to indicate Jake. "He just dropped by. First time?" "No, maybe once before. He's really okay, Remy. He gave Brad and me a ride back from school in his Jaguar. It's so nice to ride in it." Brad showed some interest at last, using his arms as around a steering wheel and making revving sounds with his mouth. "It's a first-class car," he said. "Lots of power." It was too much for me. It seemed that both of them meant to put some kind of pressure on me. But how could they like this, riding in the car of the man who had dispossessed their father and was now feeding them sugar? But then I thought kindly, they were too small to understand. Arlene looked into my face boldly. There was this about her, her boldness. She was pretty too. I liked her fine features, swimming black eyes and chiseled mouth. Some day she would make some man a fine wife. Fine, but a great nagger. "Do you miss me, Ramy?" "Sure I do." "And Brad?" "Yes, yes. Is there any doubt?" "And Ma?" "What a foolish question." "Then come to us. We miss you too. Ma cries for you." "I cry for her too." "You cry? A boy?" "Foolish girl," I said. "Then come live with us. We didn't mind too much when you were at Robin Hill, but River Bottom?" "Shut up, Arlene. I can't do it." "Mr. Jake?" "Don't tell me anything about him. I don't want to hear about him." "You don't like him?" "Should I?" "You're too young anyhow to understand." I rose to go, aiming to slip out by the back way rather than confront Jake again. At the back door, Arlene maliciously said, "Guess what we're having for supper? Pork chops, all garlicky." She knew how much I liked pork chops, especially Ma's way, the juicy way, the garlicky way with mushroom sauce. That was why she said that. I left without looking back. For supper, we had codfish and ackee. Not a bad dish, but compared to pork chops, codfish was pretty poor fare. It was well done, though, and the yam was good. I had been pretty miserable since I had left the house, but had managed to keep it out of my conversation with father. I kept everything pertaining to him and Ma out of our conversations, but I guessed it was what Arlene had said about their supper which made me decide to get this thing off my chest. "I stopped at Ma's this afternoon," I said. "Good," father said. "How are they?" "Fine." "And your Ma?" "Fine." Jake was there, rocking in a chair. Your chair. With a fork heaped with ackee, laced with codfish poised between his plate and mouth, father looked up. "Who?" "Jake, sir." "Oh." He slowed down in his eating. I guess he didn't want to eat any more, but kept up the show for my benefit. I goaded him. "You think Ma actually likes him?" "I don't know, Remy. Why shouldn't she? He's a person." "I mean really likes him. Not in the Christian way, but likes him, really likes him after what he's done to you?" "I don't know what you mean, son." "I mean, sir, she didn't even seem to be angry at him. Said they were talking about school business. But so what? She should have been a bit more clipped. Know what I mean, father?" "Well, she was calling him Mr. Hibbertson, but to my mind, she should have gone farther and said, 'Yes, Mr. Hibbertson. No, Mr. Hibbertson.' He looked too comfortable to me. He should have been on the veranda on his wretched school business or something like that." "Your mother is politer than that, Remy," father said, putting down his fork. "Yes, sir. Jake's kinder than I thought," he said after a while. "Maybe he was there to console her." "That's what I mean, sir. He seemed kinder than I thought. He seemed human." "What do you mean?" father snapped. "Nothing, sir." I knew that I had touched something in him. He had changed since I had begun to speak to him of Jake's being at the house, almost savagely, not like him at all. He rammed tobacco from a pouch into his pipe and jammed it just as savagely between his teeth and lit it. To speak the truth, the aroma of the tobacco was a relief. It seemed to clear the air about the heaviness because it had become quite heavy. There was something mysterious which I had awakened, and the tobacco seemed to have removed it, or at least to have lightened it. It must have done more, though. It must have entered my head and made me a bit reckless, because for no sensible reason whatsoever I said, You think Ma aims to marry him? What, boy? He snapped up from the chair, but his arms hung heavy and limp from his broad shoulders. What? He repeated. Sorry, sir. I was indeed sorry, for he was not just angry, he was afraid of what I had said. But I had had to say it, for it had bothered me for better than 2 hours, too. I saw the change in his face, the fear of something or other, something irrevocable would have taken place. Ma would be married to another man, then father could never win her back, never. I found it shocking, too. For the first time, my God, she'd be gone forever. Yes, father was afraid. If he must regain Ma, he would have to work fast, and yet I knew him, knew that he wouldn't look in Ma's direction, even if he were pining. In his mouth the pipe remained forgotten, but his glassy eyes softened just as soon as he relaxed. Smiling, he sucked deeply on the pipe. Sorry, son, he said, touching my head. He rubbed it fondly. Then he laughed, his gurgling, boyish laugh, and said, Aren't we silly, you and me? Yes, father, but he wasn't fooling me. Come, let's wash up the dishes. We gathered the plates and washed them first, and then the pots, and all the while, if I got the chance, I looked at him in an attempt to read his face. I believed his thoughts were far away, but who was I to know for sure?